Hey everybody, it's PartyElite, and today we're taking a look at MENACE, the next turn-based tactical RPG from the folks at Bought Us Battle Brothers, bringing some great challenge to the world of sci-fi tactical combat. In this video, we'll dive into some absolute essentials you need to know before you begin, and if you've got any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments down below, and I'll answer all that I can. Otherwise, if you've been playing for some time yourself before you've stumbled upon this video and have some pointers of your own you'd like to share, feel free to drop those in the comments down below too, for anybody who might be reading. Now, with no more time to waste on an introduction and with timestamps down below, let's begin. The initial setup. When starting a new campaign, your first critical decision is to figure out which squad leaders to bring as your starting set. The pool you have to choose from are all Marines, and once the game starts, getting new squad leaders is expensive, and you also can't be sure what order they'll become available in. More on that later. That means that this is your only chance to reliably determine the composition of your starting party for a potentially significant number of missions, and to that end, I recommend going in with 3 infantry squad leaders and 1 pilot, especially for your first few attempts. The former is able to field up to 8 soldiers alongside themselves each, while the latter gives you access to vehicles and mechs. While it can be tempting to think you'll field multiple tanks and dominate the battlefields right from the beginning, I'll explain later why that's not actually how things work out, and how even acquiring multiple quality vehicles can be challenging in the backwater system that you're working in. Infantry are more easily and cheaply kitted out, and they're also more easily replaced, but having at least 1 vehicle gives you a bit more mobility, some additional armor to hide behind, and the option to very effectively punch through some early enemy armor and, failing that, at least suppress your targets, a very powerful tool in the battles of MENACE. When picking individuals, their star rating represents a summary of their stats, and if you're wondering why you shouldn't just get all of the highest rated individuals, then the key counterpoints you should consider here are supply cost, promotion tax, and growth potential. Supply cost says how much of your limited deployment resources it costs to just put the squad leader onto the field for any given mission on their own. This is often just a small part of a greater whole, but fact is that sometimes the difference between a squad leader costing 4 supply and 20 supply is the difference between having a critical piece of equipment on hand or needing to leave it behind. Promotion tax, meanwhile, tells you how much this supply cost goes up for every time your squad leader is promoted and given a new perk from their perk tree. While you can choose not to promote squad leaders and keep their costs down as a result, you'll quickly find yourself falling behind if that's the blanket approach you choose to take across the board. Growth potential, meanwhile, tells you how quickly this particular squad leader is likely to see their attributes and stats scale up across missions. Lower quality squad leaders tend to have a higher growth potential to represent the fact that though they are green and inexperienced, they can learn and improve more quickly, whereas a grizzled veteran may be stuck in their ways. It's also important to consider each squad leader's unique perk, shown here, and if they line up with how you like to play. Studying the perk trees, meanwhile, will give you an idea of how these individuals might best be used and evolved through promotions. I wanted to highlight these specific elements when it comes to the critical decision of picking your starting squad leaders, but now let's dive deeper and take a closer look at attributes, stats, and promotions. The squad leader's capabilities provide a foundation for their squad's performance, and there are quite a few different sets of stats and attributes to keep in mind. These 4 icons represent the unit's armor, which we'll talk about in more detail later, their ability to spot concealed units, their ability to conceal themselves, and the number of tiles they're able to see, provided the view isn't obstructed by dense forests, buildings, the smoke from a smoke grenade or shell, and other such obstacles. Time of day, weather conditions, equipment, and certain actions like deploying or hiding in trees can impact the latter 3 stats, and when it comes to spotting concealed units within vision range, it's simply a matter of a spotting unit's detection stat compared to the hiding unit's concealment stat. Bigger number wins, and proximity below the spotting unit's max vision acts against concealment too, while various factors like, again, hiding in the trees, will bolster their concealment instead. Down here, the first thing to keep in mind is that stats and attributes are tied to each other, and down the road, this approach should give the game more versatility in terms of modifiers on one side of the relationship, but not the other. For now, agility is tied to action points, with a max agility of 100, giving 120 action points per turn to use for any moving, shooting, or using of abilities and equipment on the battlefield, with various perks and status effects potentially modifying the total available action points in a turn at times too. A squad with fewer action points can do less per turn. It's as simple as that, and even 5 action points can make the difference between getting behind cover and being caught out in the open. Weapon skill and accuracy have a 1-to-1 relationship, and naturally, the more accurate a squad is, the higher the chance of them actually hitting their targets. Accuracy is often modified by equipment, range, and other conditions, and it's extremely important, as you might imagine. Valor and discipline are also similarly related, with a higher value representing better resistance to suppression, an extremely critical mechanic, as we'll get into later in the video, so being able to resist it is extremely useful. Units have a hidden morale stat based off their discipline, and if that drops below certain thresholds, a unit might start wavering and eventually fleeing. A wavering unit has its action points and accuracy reduced significantly, and a fleeing unit, meanwhile, spends its turn trying to get away from the enemy. There's no giving them orders. Your own units will return from fleeing status always, but an enemy unit that's taken enough damage might just disband if it's set to flee, so you can redirect your firepower elsewhere if you're feeling lucky. Morale is impacted by things like taking losses, taking damage, losing allied units, seeing allies rout, failing or completing objectives, destroying enemy units, and it's a critical tool on the battlefield. Morale can recover quite quickly though, so using shock and awe tactics goes a long way. Rather than significantly damaging one unit with focus fire and potentially killing it off, whittling down multiple units can cause a mass rout, even forcing entirely unhurt enemy units to waver or flee. And discipline is modified by the authority strategic resource that we'll discuss later as well. Toughness is typically at 50, where it gives no boons, but maxed out at 100, it gives 50% damage reduction, and the reverse as it goes below 50, scaling up and down accordingly. Damage reduction does what it says on the tin can. Any incoming damage is reduced by this percentage, keeping the squad members alive and fighting for longer. Each individual in a squad has an impact on its output and efficiency, so every bit of damage reduction goes a very long way, especially since hit points, tied to vitality, tend to be very, very low in this game. Hit points represent how much damage a squad can take before it loses an individual. So a squad with 11 hit points and 5 members, including the squad leader, can take a total of 55 damage before it's wiped, but every 11 damage, it loses an individual. That's one less person wielding a weapon in that squad, directly reducing the squad's efficiency, especially as it pertains to damage output. A vitality of 100 can give a squad 20 hit points, but without armor, even 20 hit points can be just a matter of just 1 or 2 hits from even the weakest weapon. But it is worth noting that the last person to drop in a squad is always the squad leader, so a squad with more squaddies and with higher HP keeps the squad leader safer for longer. Next up is precision, related to critical chance, with a precision of 100 giving a 25% crit chance. Should a shot land a critical hit, it does 50% more damage than usual. Finally, positioning translates to defense, and that can range up to 50%, but can drop below 0 too, and this acts against an enemy to reduce their accuracy when trying to hit this squad. All of these stats and attributes will grow over time based on a squad leader's growth potential. The higher this number, the more quickly a squad leader will improve, and it's worth noting that the triggers for these numbers to go up are entirely action-based. That is to say, a squad that does or faces certain things during a mission will trigger a chance for a related stat or attribute to be increased, but repeated instances of a trigger within a mission have subsequently lower chances of doing so, so you can't just grind these stats. Development over time is meant to be slow but impactful. The other stats, including growth potential itself, aren't impacted in these ways. Supply cost represents how much it costs to deploy this squad leader with no equipment or squad members. Not something you'll ever really do, but it does let you know the base cost when you consider everything else to be modifiers on top of it. When prepping for a mission, you'll have a maximum amount of supply available to determine how many squads and what equipment and weapons you can deploy, so this cost has a direct impact on those decisions. Promotion tax, meanwhile, is the cost added to said supply cost every time a squad leader receives a promotion. So, Sometimes you'll prefer not to promote a squad leader to ensure you're still able to deploy them cheaply. It can be tempting to just promote everybody as soon as you get the chance, but doing so could leave you in a position where you either have to reduce a squad's efficiency, demote a squad leader, or leave a whole squad behind. I'll explain that more in just a bit, but let's first discuss what a promotion actually is. Character progression is a very unique process in MENACE. As I already mentioned, growth potential and seeing action is what creates a natural and somewhat harder to control and predict uptick in a squad leader's attributes and stats, influencing their squad's performance, basically leveling them up naturally over time behind the scenes. Beyond that, though, are these promotions, which is the part that you have direct control over. Every successful mission gives you a handful of promotion points modified by the mission's difficulty and any completed secondary objectives. These points can then be accumulated and spent across all your squad leaders, even if they weren't involved in these missions. A squad leader can only be promoted 7 times, and each time you can get them a new perk from their perk tree, with the first perk being unique for each squad leader, unlocked from the start, and worth paying attention to when picking them out. The cost of promotion scales up with each promotion, and higher tier perks are more expensive than lower tier perks, but depending on the kind of squad you're trying to build, you'll mix and match different perks from different tiers. I try not to consider promotions the same as leveling up in other RPGs, as that might create a false pressure to continuously pursue these promotions. Again, some squad leaders, especially in the early and mid-game, are best left at a low level, maybe with just something to increase their growth potential. Others will be especially worth promoting because of how they match your playstyle and the various perks that are available to them. There's a lot to explore on these fronts, so spend some time learning their different perks to see what works for you. But a squad is nothing without the armor on their backs and the weapons in their hands. So let's move on to understanding the equipment. There is a huge selection of equipment in MENACE, and I want to highlight how it works and go over specific critical attributes. First, the 2 types of squad leaders require different types of equipment. Pilots need a vehicle, and vehicles are typically modular with weapon hardpoints of different sizes, as well as some accessory slots that all have unique and situational uses. A pilot cannot be added to a mission unless they have a vehicle assigned, which is itself quite costly on the supply calculations, and each piece of modular equipment added will increase the cost further. Infantry squads are a bit more complex. First, you can choose how many squad members, or squaddies, are in a squad, from 2 to 8. These are in addition to the squad leader, so a 2 here means a squad of 3, which is important because every member of the squad carries their designated infantry weapon, and when told to shoot, each individual fires their gun and can individually miss or hit and do damage. So a fire order for a gun that fires 2 rounds at a time will shoot 6 rounds when there's 2 squaddies, but 18 rounds when there's 8. If you assign an infantry special, however, the squad leader replaces their basic weapon with the special. So now, with that same aforementioned weapon, 2 squaddies fire 4 rounds and 8 squaddies fire 16. When looking at a fire order on the battlefield, you'll see the damage output written out like this, representing the potential maximum damage as the weapon's base stat, multiplied by the number of rounds fired, further multiplied by the number of people using said weapon, since again, every round does damage individually for a sum total. Special weapons, meanwhile, range from sniper rifles to mining lasers, and while a standard weapon can be fired at any time, these specials typically require the squad to use a deploy action first, preventing them from moving until they spend the action points to undeploy. Next, you'll see infantry can also don armor and carry accessories, with the number of accessory slots typically impacted by the armor that they're wearing and any perks that they may have acquired. Accessories include grenades of various types, combat drugs, night vision goggles, various kinds of ammunition that modify weapon stats, and even recon drones and more. These will all have varying degrees of usefulness depending on the circumstances and squad leader at hand, but I'd recommend bringing sources of extra ammo more often than not, as almost all weapons only have a limited number of uses until their ammo runs dry, and especially in earlier missions while you're getting a hang of things, you're going to run out of ammo. This applies to most vehicle weapons too. Some weapons don't use ammo and instead generate heat with each use, and have debuffs when at higher and higher levels of heat. Alternatively, they need to vent before they can be reused, and that's action points down the drain in certain stressful scenarios, let's say. But on this note, let's turn our attention to weapon stats. First, you can see here the different kinds of actions a weapon grants the squad, and you can see the number of uses that the weapon has by default on the battlefield as a whole. This number of uses is shared between all the different firing actions from a single weapon across the board. It's all coming from the same pool of ammunition after all. Higher up here are a few tags to help you get a quick read on the weapon, but down below is where the meat is. Trade value just tells you how much the weapon is worth at the black market. Range tells you how many tiles out the weapon is able to shoot, and accuracy modifier only shows up when applicable to tell you if the weapon will change the squad's accuracy up or down. Hit point damage represents how much damage a single round of this weapon does when it isn't reduced by armor or other factors. Armor damage tells you how much damage armor eats when it stops a round from penetrating, and armor penetration tells you how much armor the weapon is able to ignore and penetrate. If this number matches or is greater than the target's armor value, every hit will fully penetrate and do HP damage. If it's lower, then there's only a chance of a shot penetrating. Bear in mind that armor will not be damaged and reduced if a shot penetrates it, so if most of your troops don't have the ability to penetrate enemy armor, your attacks will still reduce enemy armor, and once it's reduced enough, weapons with lower armor penetration will then be able to punch through that lower armor value. The suppression value here is applied in full to a target when one of its individuals takes a hit, per hit, but a reduced amount is applied if the shot misses and lands in the same tile, and a further reduced amount is applied if the shot lands in an adjacent tile. Some guns prioritize suppression over damage, and as mentioned before, suppression is very powerful in Menace, as I'll explain in more detail shortly. Elements hit represents how many individuals in the target unit get hit by a single shot of the weapon. Usually you'll see that even the most highest damage output weapons still only hit one element. So if you fire, for example, a giant laser at an enemy squad and do hundreds of points of damage, if the element's hit number is 1, then you can still only do as much damage as one individual can take, maximum. Finally, rate of fire tells you how many shots are fired per fire order, factoring into the damage calculations as described just moments ago. On the battlefield, different attack options might have different numbers, so make sure to investigate all of them to make sure you're picking what's right for the circumstances. Further down is a very useful chart that tells you the optimal range in which a weapon is best used while denoting the minimum and maximum ranges too. Kinetic weapons will see their damage and armor penetration values fall off to varying degrees over greater distances, while optimal accuracy ranges tend to shift based on the weapon at hand. These charts can also often be different for the same weapon using different attack options, so again, make sure to reference them individually as you plan your maneuvers and attacks, and arm your squads according to how you intend to use them. Armor stats are also worth going over in detail, as armor is exceptionally important on the brutal battlefields of Menace. Armor just tells you how much protection the equipment provides as a baseline, but a weapon that has armor penetration that matches or beats this number will simply punch right through and cause regular hit point damage. But armor can also take damage, reducing this number when it does, making it easier to penetrate. Armor durability determines how easily the armor actually takes damage, with a higher durability meaning the armor can suffer heavier fire before it starts to weaken. Accessory slots are also determined by armor, and this just says how many accessories a squad can carry when they're using this piece of armor, and when applicable, you'll see any impact to concealment and vision stats as well. Extremely heavy armor in particular applies a negative modifier to both. Some armor types also give access to special abilities, and they'll be listed on these tooltips as relevant too. As you're poking around all these variables and options though, there's one more piece of information assigned to each item, and that's what we're going to discuss next. Supply. Supply basically acts as a balancing tool, representing the logistical limitations of deploying troops and restocking and repairing their gear after a mission. More advanced equipment needs more specialized maintenance, and so you'll see this simple relationship between how powerful something is and the supply it needs to deploy. When prepping for a mission, you'll need to work to this supply limit by adjusting who and what you're taking planetside. Squad leaders, again, have a baseline cost, and each individual squaddy has a cost associated with their equipment. In other words, the base cost of the gun or the armor is multiplied by the number of squad members that are carrying it, including the squad leader. Spend some time fiddling here, as the right loadout will make a huge difference. Do you really need that RPG, or should you set it aside for better armor? Consider also saving on squaddies to have more squads in battle instead. 1 or 2 more squaddies in a squad with powerful equipment can cause more damage with a salvo, sure, but an additional squad in their stead, even if weaker, gives you more opportunities to react and move on the battlefield. A weak squad that's able to flank the enemy is worth more than 2 very well equipped but pinned squaddies. Apart from that, make sure you really think about how you intend to use a squad and kit them out accordingly. If you've got somebody with an RPG or sniper rifle special, and you intend to almost entirely rely just on those weapons, maybe they don't need more than 2 squaddies. Maybe they don't need the heaviest armor or the most powerful accessories. Is your sniper likely to need a grenade that they can only throw so far? Naturally, these decisions can only be made confidently if you're sure you'll be able to stick to your plan. As you progress through a campaign, you'll find later missions give more and more supply to work with, and some factions will provide you with upgrades you can install to either increase how much supply you have or reduce how much supply certain things cost. On that topic, let's discuss strategic resources. There are all kinds of moving parts to manage at the strategic level, starting with these 4 critical resources. Promotion points, earned through the completion of primary and secondary objectives, are used to unlock new perks for your squad leaders. Each subsequent promotion is more and more expensive for a single squad leader, and some have perks that make promotions cheaper than usual. Keep that in mind as you try to figure out who to prioritize. Promotion points are a shared resource, and you can absolutely promote the same squad leader multiple times at once, even if they haven't even been on the field yet. You just need to have enough points accumulated. Authority is primarily earned by performing exceptionally well during your operations, and it can be both earned and spent during random events. Authority has 2 key uses beyond these random events though. Hiring squad leaders is a 2-step process. First, you need to acquire a dossier from the black market, bartering away some of your loot and rewards to do so, and then you need to head to the hiring screen to actually hire the squad leader at the expense of some of your authority. You never know whose dossier is going to turn up, so you don't actually have to hire the newly available squad leader if you don't like them. You can simply avoid hiring them and get an additional dossier instead when it becomes available at the black market until you actually decide to pick somebody up. Bear in mind that infantry and pilot squad leaders have separate dossier, and just note that it is a good idea to secure some additional squad leaders nice and early. Sending the same person on several back-to-back missions can make them wary, followed by exhausted, and this has huge negative impacts on the battlefield, effectively taking them out of the fight for some time. But I digress. The other use of authority is to bolster your squad's discipline, making them more resistant to suppression and less likely to break ranks and waver or flee, mechanics I'll explain in just a moment. Next up are OCI components, acquired through the completion of operations and certain choices in random events. These serve a singular purpose, and that's to upgrade the TCR and impetus with additional capabilities ranging from off-map combat support to the ability to save squaddies that got dropped in combat, and much more besides. One such additional capability actually provides another important strategic resource: intelligence. A higher intelligence level reveals more information to you when you're planning for a mission, highlighting which pings on the map are friendlies and which are enemies, with higher levels of intelligence revealing the unit classes, squad sizes, and even equipment you can expect to face. As you can imagine, this can be hugely beneficial in the planning stage to both pick out appropriate equipment of your own and for positioning during your initial deployment. The last of the resources listed up here is manpower, or squaddies, the individual members of your squads that can die pretty readily in battle. You don't have an infinite pool of squaddies to keep drawing from, and this number represents how many you have left, with more available through certain OCI upgrades and through the black market recruitment drives, both coming at a cost. Running out of squaddies makes it impossible to deploy infantry squads, but even before that, it significantly reduces the combat efficiency of any squads that needed to sacrifice their squaddie count. Next is a bit of an odd resource. Trust is something you earn with each of the factions primarily by accomplishing missions for them, and as you accumulate enough trust, you'll gain trust levels, and with each trust level, you'll be able to unlock a relevant upgrade to install on the ship using OCI components as described earlier. These can provide a huge variety of benefits, from additional off-map support options to optimize supply costs, and you should investigate which you like the sound of to prioritize improved trust with the appropriate factions. Finally, there are strategic resources that are a bit more temporary. When you're taking on an operation, the branching missions don't just offer different objectives and difficulty, but different strategic assets for you and your enemies alike. These are typically temporary, lasting only the duration of the operation, but sometimes they'll provide equipment that you'll get to keep permanently. Keep an eye out for what each of these do, and secure the ones that could come in handy by attempting the missions associated with them. And, if you see any in red, these are helping the enemy for the duration of the operation unless you go in and complete the associated mission, potentially fundamentally changing enemy actions and capabilities on the battlefield. But on the topic of missions, let's finally take a look at the battlefield. The turn system. Perhaps one of the most critical elements of a turn-based tactics game is understanding the turn system, and Menace doesn't follow the standard approach. Rather than using initiative or an I go, you go system, in Menace we see alternating activations. Here, every faction only moves one unit at a time, going back and forth until all units have moved at least once, and then starting over. The factions always move in the same order: you first, then neutral or allied units, and then the enemy. And if one faction has many more units than another, they get to move all their extra units at the end of the round. Important terminology here. Every unit has a turn, and after every unit has acted out their turn, a new round begins, replenishing every unit's action points and giving them a new set of turns to act. With this system, there is no such thing as initiative. In every round, you can choose to go with a completely different turn order, and your enemies can do the same. This introduces a lot of unpredictability to the flow of combat. Who's going to move first? Should you shoot target A or target B? Neither have acted yet, so they're both equal threats. But if one of them has already acted this round, maybe it can be deprioritized. This also allows you to, for example, move a unit last in the current round and then first in the next, setting up and executing an ambush in a way not possible in other systems. But there's a lot more than just turn orders to consider, of course. To win on the battlefields of Menace, you really need to know the enemy and yourself. As described earlier, securing intelligence, either through OCI upgrades or mission rewards during an operation, is an excellent way to give yourself some tactical advantage. The higher your intelligence level, the more information you'll have before you deploy, including exact enemy locations, unit classes, and more, allowing you to equip your squads accordingly and place them appropriately. Once on the battlefield, there's a lot more information waiting to be found. Above a unit's head, you'll find 3 bars, typically. An empty one that fills in yellow to represent suppression, broken into thirds to represent unaffected, suppressed, and pinned. Below that, a gray one that represents armor, and below that, hit points. The latter two are subdivided into sections representing individual entities, so if the HP bar drops below the threshold of one section, that's one entity dead. Use this info to decide who to target from time to time. Remember, a unit does less damage as it loses entities, so you might be better off reducing the entity count of a not-so-scary multi-entity enemy unit rather than chipping away at a scary single-entity unit. Another element to keep in mind when looking at an enemy unit on the battlefield is this icon that designates their class. Some of you will recognize these as slightly modified versions of NATO military map symbols, and though they are certainly not one-to-one recreations, there are enough similarities here where this is a nice Easter egg for those in the know, and a good source of immediate information if you get familiar with the symbology. Recon, infantry, tank, anti-armor, so on and so forth. It's a nice touch, and it gives you some information to go on, both on the mission prep screen, but also when you're first encountering a new enemy, and it's very satisfying when you've guessed and understood an enemy correctly, despite never having seen it before. Hovering over the enemy gives a few additional details. The tooltip here will point out certain status effects, and even highlight key equipment. As with Battle Brothers, Learning what these mean is part of the fun, though sometimes you'll have your own status effects and equipment to compare them to for reference. These status effects, by the way, can be both temporary and permanent for the duration of a mission, and either way, it's good to keep in mind what they do and learn them so that you can take advantage of the buffs and debuffs they apply. Investigate them frequently and consider when they might be impacting your or an enemy's accuracy, defenses, concealment, so on and so forth. Hovering on an enemy unit also shows you their attack range, and pressing R on the keyboard with a squad selected will additionally show you the enemy's movement ranges. But remember, just like you have to spend AP from the same pool to move and shoot and use actions, so too does the enemy. So keep that in mind as you're comparing movement and attack ranges, and use this information to stay out of reach or to sit where the enemy's weapon damage and accuracy drops low enough to not be too big of a bother. Careful positioning, keeping an eye on enemy capabilities, watching out for status effects, you might have started to realize that in battle, you really need to act with caution. Menace will feature frequent ambushes, and though you'll eventually get access to various ways to increase your vision and detection stats, and maybe even equipment that pings enemies in the fog of war, the vast majority of your time will be spent on methodical advances. Rushing has little value, even if you're trying to hit the turn limit-oriented secondary objectives, and though your units will stop when they spot a new enemy unit, some might be very well concealed and unspottable, even when you're right next to them, like if they're hiding in the trees. That aside, even if you do spot the enemy, a slightly different approach might have given you enough flexibility to duck into cover or deploy to increase your defenses rather than get caught stuck out in the open. When moving into the fog of war, make sure to leave enough AP to shoot, retreat, or deploy. You can tell what actions will become unavailable after your currently selected one because they'll start to flash like this. I like to try and move in ways that leave multiples of 40 AP left over at first, and then multiples of 20. That's because 80 AP is enough to fire most weapons twice, and 20 AP is enough to deploy or move one tile with just a little bit of AP left over. This does mean that specifics matter. Moving straight from one tile to another could leave you with 2 attacks against an enemy, newly revealed or not, while moving diagonally might only leave you with enough AP for one shot with an awkward amount spare. Now, leftover AP does not carry over from turn to turn, so use it or lose it. Careful planning then can make a world of difference even on the lowest difficulty. But consider as well the decision to shoot twice versus shoot and retreat into cover, or deploy and shoot only once if that's what the math comes down to. Deploying not only increases your accuracy, but it also significantly increases your defense bonus to reduce enemy accuracy by extension, and it also helps with damage reduction and increased concealment. So this means if your unit was spotted, you could deploy and become untargetable by the enemy, as indicated by this concealed icon here, unless they move closer and spot you again, but that aside, it means more damage out and less damage in. Accuracy is a significant consideration, as we'll discuss more in the next section, so you should always treat it as paramount. Similarly, getting into cover is hugely beneficial, reducing enemy hit chances and bolstering protection, so try to always get into cover, even if it means taking the long way to the destination. In a pinch, you can use any accompanying vehicle as cover as well, and sometimes, cover just won't cut it, and you'll need to retreat instead, or in a worst-case scenario, abort the mission and fail the operation. Remember, any squaddies lost on the battlefield are gone for good, with just a small chance of rescuing a few at the end of a mission. Vehicles that take damage or suffer defects, as we'll discuss later, will carry those over between missions in an operation. Battles are very high stakes in Menace, and beyond caution, there are some key considerations and mechanics to know to ensure particularly effective combat. First, on a strategic level, some of the best early missions to take on are against the pirates. These will grant you some good loot off the battlefield, either for immediate use or for barter. Missions against aliens will grant you some resources to trade out too, but nothing that you can actually equip, and sometimes that pirate equipment can make a pretty big difference early on. Now, it is worth noting that trading in the black market is a great way to secure progression. There are some very cool pieces of equipment available in the black market, so even though the pirate missions can give you some early additional equipment to use, those alien missions are equally helpful in bartering. Now, on to the tactical level. First, remember that morale damage, as described earlier, and suppression, as I'm about to describe, are two linchpins. Not all units suffer the effects of suppression, but those that do, including your own, will take a significant hit to the number of action points they have access to, as well as their accuracy when suppressed, all while being forced to deploy to further reduce their mobility on their turn. Additional suppression that crosses the threshold to the next level forces a unit prone, marking them as pinned down, meaning they'll be unable to take any action other than crawling to safety. Suppression accumulates when under fire, as described in the section about equipment, filling this yellow bar up to cross the aforementioned thresholds marked by dividing lines. Cover, armor, and discipline protect against suppression, so make sure to use them well yourself, as suppression can effectively neutralize a threat temporarily because of the huge debuffs it applies. But suppression reduces between turns, so it's only a matter of time before a unit fully recovers unless the suppressive fire continues. While vehicles don't suffer suppression, they suffer debuffing status effects called defects on every 25% of HP lost, and these can be hugely debilitating. But you can suppress units that are riding inside an open-top vehicle by firing away at it, limiting their capabilities when they unload, and if you're lucky, you might even score a couple of kills. This is very helpful when you're being swarmed by a bunch of enemies driving into combat. The debuffs from suppression are big enough that sometimes, and in fact often, simply suppressing an enemy unit is enough to ignore it for the rest of the round. Do not underestimate this powerful tool, as it allows you to overcome situations where the action economy is heavily weighed against you. On which note, accuracy drops are more significant than they might sound. Going from good to medium is actually a huge drop, and each little notch on the bar here can represent a significant loss in efficiency. With limited ammunition, make sure you're trying to secure as much accuracy as possible. Just the deployment accuracy buff alone can be the difference between a squad wipe and just a bit of chip damage. Cover is similarly extremely powerful, and you should look to regularly fix your enemies in position using suppression and pinning, and then flank them to secure direct hits and HP damage. Bear in mind that you can intentionally shoot next to an enemy unit to cause the aforementioned reduced suppression damage. Guns don't have to target an enemy, so if they're just outside of your range by a tile, shoot the ground in front of them. If you're lucky, a shot might miss the target tile and hit the entity in an adjacent tile instead. Bullets don't just disappear into thin air if they miss their targets, and they can damage adjacent units too, including causing friendly fire, so do be careful. Similarly, bullets can be fired at where you think an enemy is, and even if you're just shooting blindly at a question mark or into some trees, you can cause damage and suppression, and even score kills. On that note, let's very briefly discuss just a few critical battle effects. Some battle effects and status effects last the duration of a mission, like having magazine pouches equipped, while others last across multiple missions between operations, like temporary modifiers that squad leaders might have that can last up to 5 missions across multiple operations, or vehicle status effects and defects that can last across multiple missions within the same operation, unless you've unlocked certain upgrades to repair them between missions, of course. Others are much more situational. In missions where you need to capture a zone, for example, a little red flag represents enemy units that are countering the little green flags above friendly units, and the number of green flags minus the number of red flags at the end of a round will fill the capture counter up accordingly. Any unit that's wavering or fleeing, however, will not have this capturing status, so keep an eye out for these flags to understand what is and isn't a threat to your mission progress. Active status effects can be seen here on friendlies and here on enemy units, and you do very well to learn them and use them to your advantage when possible, especially the defects that impact vehicles and static defenses at every 25% HP threshold, and in the case of your own vehicles, carry over between missions. A destroyed gun on a turret, fires that do damage over time until extinguished, and damage to weapon systems that mean a vehicle is increasingly likely to have its gun jam every time it tries to shoot. So maybe it's not worth the supply cost of bringing it to the next mission in the operation unless you can repair it and make it reliable. These are all very important considerations, not just during a single battle, but again, between them too. There are a lot of moving parts in Menace coming together to make a punishing but rewarding experience for the clever tactician. I hope this video helped you get an understanding of some core concepts, and if so, please consider leaving a like and a comment down below, and maybe send it over to friends who might be struggling with the game or sharing it otherwise. I'll try to answer any questions in the comments below, and otherwise, don't hesitate to subscribe for more Menace and generally more strategic and tactical gaming. As always, a massive thanks goes out to all of the channel members and patrons who've been supporting the channel on a monthly basis. Y'all keep us alive and running smoothly, and of course, a big old thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.